Hey guys, it's Miss Phoebus, and I'm back with lesson 4, and this lesson is about knots. So you may not think that knots are really mathematical, but they are. And I'm gonna have you watch a video later on that's about a mathematician talking about mathematical knots. These knots are aren't really mathematical, but knots are something that have been used for a very, very long time. In fact, some of the oldest jewelry in the world from 82,000 years ago has been found in a Moroccan cave. This was several years ago, but um, they are shells with holes pierced through them, and as well as it's got some clay and some dye, so that's why they think that it's a necklace that they found. And those necklaces would have had to have some sort of string for these shells, and those strings would probably have knots. So we're looking at some of the earliest mathematics as far as knots go and knot tying goes, um, found here with this oldest jewelry. So again, we think about beads. Beads indicate that we have jewelry. Jewelry means that we have cords, and cords means that we need knots to secure that jewelry. In looks like the Book of Kells, we have an illustrated copy of the Bible, which is from 800 AD, and we have a whole bunch of ornamental Celtic knots. And so if you look in the different parts of the picture, especially around the edges and the corners, you're going to be able to see Celtic knots. And scattered through the text are decorated initials and small figures of animals and humans, often twisted and tied into complicated knots. When we look at mathematics, the study of knots is about closed twisted loops. So we have some different knots here. We have a modern trefoil knot, and we have a Celtic trefoil knot, and so they're basically the same thing. It's just a little bit drawn a little bit differently. But basically, this is an endless knot. If you pick a point on the knot, and like maybe take your finger and kind of hover it over your screen and follow it all the way around, it's almost like a pretzel. But in this case, this pretzel has no ends to it. So this is called an endless knot made from a single strand. And these crossovers are where the pieces kind of intersect each other. And so that mathematically we find interesting about how many crossings something has. Knots, we can rearrange them, but not untie them. And so when we can do that, we can create knots that are similar but look a little bit different. Knots which have been rearranged to have no crossovers at all are called unknots. The best way to start studying knots is by actually tying them, which is a little bit easier than drawing them. Knots are constructed from linked strands, referred to as links, and coloring can help. So if you notice, if you follow the blue, you can see that that is a continuous knot. And then if you follow the red through, you can see that that is a continuous knot. And then the same thing for the green. So that's what mathematicians do sometimes, especially if they have separate strands, is that they will color them or use different colored ropes to indicate different components of the knot, and it makes it a little bit easier to see the components. Some decorative knot patterns are formed, so you can kind of see, are these endless loops? Are they one piece? How many separate strands are needed to make up each of these designs? That's the question. So I want you to pause the video. I want you to figure out how many pieces make up A, how many pieces make up B, and how many pieces of string make up C. As you can see, I've applied some color to A, and it allows us to see that there are 3 strands in the example A, I've got them in 3 different colors, and each strand is actually a closed loop. So I'm going to do the same thing for B. Alright, there's B. B is 2 strands, and they are not in a closed loop. Notice that the ends are going off, and they are not connected to anything. Now I'm going to do C. And C looks like it is 3 strands, and they are in a closed loop. They are continuous pieces. So it's very much like A, but it's in a different pattern. And as I was doing this, I was thinking about, well, this kind of looks like the trefoil knot, the Celtic trefoil knot. And if we're seeing these happening at 800 AD in these books where they're using them as decorations, these have to have been around for a while for people to make things very ornate and very detailed. So these knots have been around for a long time, even in the drawings. And so even though you might not think that it's mathematics, this art is connected to math. Let's get rid of our... So we have 2 Celtic knot patterns below that look similar, except that one might be described as a 4x4. That would mean that the A is shorter in one dimension than B, but A looks like a square, right? The length and the width look the same. Whereas B would be a 5x4, where maybe we call that the length along the bottom is longer than the height of that square. What is the fundamental difference between them? Some knot patterns, like this, can be formed from a single strand, and others need several strands. What can you say about the dimension of these 2 types? So, I mean, and you can kind of compare. I definitely would pause the video, see if you can figure out what's going on. I'm going to add some color in just a second. So with A, you should be able to tell that those are just, separate loops. So I did the first one in blue and red, and it was kind of in the center from top left corner to bottom right corner. It was one single loop. And then the next biggest loop, the one I did in green and black, that is a single loop, a closed loop itself. And then the one that's a little bit more square, I did in blue and red. And so these are closed loops that just happen to be kind of woven in and around each other. Whereas B, and I only did it in one color, but technically there are 2 pieces, kind of what it looks like, but it would be the same thing. It is one single piece, and about halfway through I realized that you might want to actually see me drawing or coloring that in so you could see it kind of closing in on itself. But even though they look about the same and they look like they have the same style pieces, they are built differently. So that is something to think about. Even though we have 2 similar structures, are they necessarily the same structure? Let's clear this before I go on to the next slide. Alright, so which of these diagrams show knots made from a single strand and which are made from linked strands? So the pictures are a little hard to tell. I went back and after I did a couple of them, I went back and kind of rethought it. And you may disagree with me, but I thought that A looked like it had two strands, and then B and C are kind of twisted on themselves, especially on the edges. And I think those could be done with one strand. But it's at least right now it's kind of in the interpretation of the picture. If we had a physical knot to play with, that we might have a different idea. Here's some more. How many link strands do you need to make a 10 crossing version of the diagram above? So we have 10 crossings, and crossings are where we are looking for those twisted pieces. So these are, both of these are, uh, both, all three of these are 10 different 10 crossings. And so, how many separate strands are there in each case? So our complicated knots or our complicated links looks like A had two strands and both B and C had one strand. So since the 19th century, over 6 billion knots and links have been classified. And so they have these numbers. The big number represents how many crossings. So we have one with 0 crossings. We have one with 3 crossings. So that's what the little ones stand for. One with 4 crossings. 1, 2 with 5 crossings. This one looks like 5. 1 looks like a star. 1, 2, 3 with 6 crossings, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 with 7 crossings, and so on. And so, looks like you've got quite a few, and then you can pick up some extra links perhaps, but what I think happens is, yeah, it looks like when we pick up an extra color, we are adding another link to it. And then when we get the green, we're adding a third link. So we're creating knots that way. So again, there's going to be a video that you need to watch. If I show the video in this video, you won't be able to hear it. So you will need to go and click and watch what is a knot. And this guy is really excited about knots. But he will talk to you about mathematical knots and why they are important and what they're important for. Alright, so that's the end of our video. And that's the end of what you need to do for this week.